For 3 years, the only communication I had with my father was the deafening silence of a phone that never rang. Our relationship, once a tapestry of Sunday morning calls and shared laughter, had been torn to shreds the day I chose my own path over his. Now, as I stood in my sterile city apartment, a crisp white envelope lay on my coffee table, a ghost from a life I thought was buried. It was from him. My heart pounded a frantic drumbeat against my ribs, a cocktail of hope and dread mixing in my veins. I reached for the letter, my fingers trembling with 3 years of unsaid apologies and longing. I was about to tear it open, to finally hear his voice again, when a shadow fell over me. "Wait!" A sharp voice cut through the air. It was my billionaire grandfather, Arthur. His eyes, usually kind, now narrowed with a chilling suspicion. "Don't open that. Not yet. Look closer, Ava. Can't you see it?" I did as he said, my excitement turning to a cold, creeping fear. The handwriting was perfect. Too perfect. What I saw next didn't just shock me. It shattered the fragile hope I had held for so long. The letter was thin, the paper crisp and expensive, unlike the slightly worn stationery my father used to prefer. His handwriting, a familiar script I'd practiced copying as a child, was there on the front. I traced the careful loops of my name, the elegant slant of his D in Dad, and a lump formed in my throat. 3 years. It had been 3 years since I walked out of that house and into my new life, a life where my ambition was a badge of honor, not a source of disappointment. 3 years of living in a world that celebrated my success while a part of me longed for the simple approval of the man who taught me to ride a bike and to love the smell of sawdust. My grandfather, Arthur, stood silently by the coffee table, his presence a stark contrast to my emotional turmoil. He was the one who had funded my venture, the one who saw my potential when my father only saw a betrayal of family tradition. But even he couldn't fill the void left by that silence. "It's really from him, Grandpa," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "Look at the return address. It's his old P.O. box. He remembers me." Arthur's gaze was steady, his expression unreadable. "He remembers you. Of course he does," he said, his voice softer than I expected. "But that doesn't mean this is what you think it is." He gently took the envelope from my hand, his long, practiced fingers turning it over, examining every detail with the keen eye of a man who built an empire on noticing things others missed. "What's wrong?" I asked, a sliver of defensiveness creeping into my tone. My heart ached for this to be a true olive branch, a sign that the rigid, traditional man I knew was finally ready to forgive. Arthur pointed to the stamp, a generic, mass-produced one, and then to the handwriting again. "The slant is wrong. Look closely." Robert's writing always leaned slightly to the right, a result of a broken wrist he had as a boy. This is perfectly straight." "And the pressure," he added, his thumb and forefinger tracing the letters on the envelope. "Robert always wrote with a heavy hand. These letters are too light, too delicate. It's an imitation, Ava. A very good one, but an imitation all the same." My stomach churned, the hopeful warmth I'd felt moments ago replaced by a cold, hard knot of dread. I wanted to argue, to defend my fragile hope, but as I looked at the envelope again, I saw what he meant. The small, almost imperceptible flaws were there, glaring at me like a betrayal. The perfect, unblemished script was a lie, and with it, my fantasy of reconciliation began to crumble. My heart hammered against my ribs, a painful and erratic rhythm. The cold reality of my grandfather's words settled over me, chilling me to the bone. "An imitation," he had said, and the word echoed in the silence of the room. My hand, which had longed to feel the paper, now felt a sudden revulsion. This was no olive branch. This was a lie, carefully crafted to mimic a hope I desperately craved. "Let's open it," Arthur said, his voice hard, the softness from before completely gone. He was no longer a gentle grandfather. He was the cunning billionaire I'd seen on the news, the one who tore apart business deals with a single, brutal fact. "We need to know what kind of game they're playing." My fingers fumbled with the flap, the paper feeling heavy and menacing in my hand. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, a harmless mix-up, but deep down, a new kind of dread was forming. I tore it open and pulled out a single sheet of paper. As I unfolded the letter, My breath hitched. The words were simple, typed, and devoid of any personal feeling. There was no, "My dearest Ava," or "I miss you," just cold, hard text. "Dearest Ava, I desperately need your help. I'm in a dire financial situation and facing a deadline to secure a large sum of money, or I will lose everything. The last 3 years have been difficult, and my situation has become critical. My bank account has been compromised, and I need a transfer of $50,000 to this account number to prevent a total disaster. The time is critical. Please do not call. I'm sorry it took this crisis for me to reach out. Your loving father, Robert." I read the letter aloud, my voice flat, hollow. The final words, "Your loving father, Robert," felt like a cruel joke, a knife twisted in the wound of our silence. Arthur took the paper from me. He didn't need to read it. He had seen enough. The lack of a personal greeting, the generic plea for money, the cold, impersonal tone, it all screamed, scam. The letter was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, designed to exploit my guilt and my desperate desire for a reunion. It was a weapon, and it was aimed directly at my heart. My hands began to shake with a furious energy that was a stark contrast to the hope I had felt just moments before. This wasn't my father reaching out. This was someone who knew our story, who knew about our estrangement, and who was using my pain against me. The audacity of it was breathtaking. "Someone knows our story," I said, the words barely a whisper. "They know about the silence. They know about my father and me." Arthur nodded grimly. "They know, and they're preying on it. But we won't let them." His eyes, usually sharp with ambition, now held a fierce, protective glint. "This isn't just about money, Ava. This is a targeted attack. Someone has studied our family, our weaknesses, and we are going to find out who it is." For the first time in a very long time, I felt a connection with my grandfather that went beyond our shared love of business. It was a shared fury, a shared purpose. The letter, once a symbol of hope, was now a clue. The game was on. The letter, now a piece of evidence rather than a source of longing, lay between us. My grandfather, Arthur, picked up his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. He was a man of action, and in his world, a problem wasn't a problem until it was being solved. "I've got a contact at the precinct," he said, his voice low and serious. "I'll have them look into this. We need to find out who's behind this, Ava." "No, Grandpa," I said, a sudden resolve hardening my voice. "Not yet. This is a family matter. If we involve the police now, it could get messy. We need to find the truth ourselves first." Arthur paused, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had expected me to be emotional, maybe even broken, but instead, he saw a fire he hadn't seen since the day I walked away from my father's business. "What do you have in mind?" he asked. "Whoever did this knew about our estrangement," I explained, the pieces of the puzzle starting to click into place. "They knew about the 3 years of silence. That means they're not a random scammer. They're someone close to my father." The silence hung heavy in the air. We both knew who the most likely suspect was. Susan, my father's ex-wife. She was a master manipulator, and she had always despised me, seeing me as a threat to her position in the family and her access to our money. I had a terrible feeling that she was behind this. "We need to find out what's really happening with my dad," I continued. "I can't just call him. He might not believe me, or worse, he might be under Susan's influence." "Good. Don't call him," Arthur agreed. "I'll get my private investigator on it. They can find out about Susan and what's been happening in your father's life." "I have my own resources," I countered, thinking of my network of tech-savvy friends. "I can do a deep dive on this cryptocurrency wallet, see if it's connected to her." Arthur smiled faintly, a hint of pride in his eyes. "You really are my granddaughter," he said. The words, once a source of conflict between me and my father, now felt like a badge of honor. We worked for the next few hours, hunched over my laptop, our shared fury fueling our efficiency. The digital trail was faint, but it was there. My friend traced the crypto wallet to a server in a remote location, but the IP address led to a proxy. Still, it was a start. As for Arthur's team, they worked fast. A few hours later, he received a text. "Susan and Robert's divorce finalized 6 months ago. Susan received a significant settlement, but it appears she's already spent most of it. Recent financial records show large, frequent transfers to various online casinos. My blood ran cold. Susan hadn't just tricked my father, she had ruined him. My heart sank, not for the money, but for the man who was now alone and vulnerable, a victim of the very person he had chosen over me. And now, she was trying to use me to finish the job. The game was on, and this time, I wasn't just playing to win. I was playing for a family I thought I'd lost forever. The anger was a cold, hard knot in my stomach. It had replaced the hope, the dread, and the fear. Now, all that was left was a burning need for justice. Susan hadn't just swindled my father, she had weaponized our pain, turning 3 years of silence into a tool for her own greedy ends. She had to be stopped. She's a master manipulator, I said to Arthur, my voice tight. She's banking on the fact that I'll be so desperate for reconciliation that I'll transfer the money without asking questions. She thinks she's untouchable. Then we prove her wrong, Arthur replied, his face a mask of stone. We set a trap. We arranged a meeting. I used a burner phone to text the number provided in the letter, pretending to be shaken but willing to help. I told Dad I would transfer a smaller amount first as a test, in cash, and that I wanted to meet face to face to discuss the rest. Susan, likely desperate for cash, fell for the bait. She suggested a quiet cafe downtown. The next day, I arrived at the cafe with Arthur, who sat a few tables away, blending in with the crowd. I was nervous, but my resolve was steel. I watched as Susan walked in, her face perfectly composed, an air of feigned concern around her. She was wearing a designer coat and carried a handbag that probably cost more than my first car. She sat down, smiled a sickly sweet smile, and I felt my blood run cold. "Ava, my dear, it's so good to see you," she said, her voice dripping with fake sincerity. "I'm so sorry it's come to this. Your father is in such a bad way." I leaned forward, my hands clasped tightly on the table. "Cut the act, Susan," I said, my voice low and steady. "I know it wasn't my dad who sent that letter." Susan's smile faltered for a split second before she regained her composure. "Ava, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just trying to help your father." "You're trying to help yourself," I retorted. "You've been tracking us, haven't you? You knew about the fight, about the 3 years of silence. You forged his handwriting and manipulated a desperate situation for your own benefit. The crypto wallet, the fake emergency, it's all you're doing." Her eyes hardened. "I'm not the one who walked away from her family, Ava. Your father has been lost without you. I was the only one there for him. You were there to bleed him dry," I shot back, the words laced with a fury I couldn't contain. "You took everything from him, and now you're trying to take more from me. You're a leech, Susan. A pathetic, greedy leech." The color drained from her face. She looked around, realizing her act had failed. "I don't know who you think you are, but you have no proof." "Proof?" I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "We have the address, the handwriting analysis from an expert, and a paper trail showing your massive gambling debts. We have everything." Susan's veneer of calm shattered. She stood up, knocking her chair over, and tried to flee. But just as she reached the door, 2 police officers, whom Arthur had discreetly called, blocked her path. "Susan Miller, you're under arrest for fraud," one of them said. I watched as they put handcuffs on her, her face a mask of rage and defeat. The entire cafe was watching, and for a moment, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and sadness. I had won, but the victory felt hollow. Because the real enemy wasn't the woman being led away in handcuffs. The real enemy had been the silence. And now, I had to face the man who had created it. After Susan was taken away, the adrenaline that had been my fuel for the past few hours began to fade, leaving a profound emptiness in its place. The victory felt hollow, devoid of the satisfaction I had expected. I had won a battle, but the war for my family was far from over. My grandfather, Arthur, placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "She's been handled," he said, his voice quiet. "Now, what about your father?" My heart ached. The thought of confronting him, of telling him about Susan's betrayal, filled me with a complex mix of anger and sorrow. I was angry at him for being so easily deceived, for choosing a woman like Susan over me, and for letting our relationship wither away. But beneath that anger was a deep-seated sadness for the man who had lost his way. I drove to my father's house, a place I hadn't set foot in for 3 years. The familiar driveway, the rose bushes he had always tended, everything was exactly as I remembered it. Yet, it felt foreign. I walked up to the front door, my hand hovering over the bell, filled with a crippling fear. What if he didn't want to see me? What if he was so consumed by guilt and shame that he would slam the door in my face? I took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. It chimed, a sound that once felt like a welcome home, now felt like a final warning. My father opened the door, and the sight of him stopped my heart. He was a shadow of the man I remembered. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes were tired and hollow, and his once vibrant smile was gone, replaced by a deep sadness. He looked older, weaker, and utterly defeated. "Ava," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "What are you doing here?" "Dad, we need to talk," I said, my voice trembling slightly. He looked at me, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. "Is this about the letter?" "I don't know what you're talking about, Ava. Please, just leave." He started to close the door, but I put my hand out to stop it. "Dad, I know it wasn't you," I said, the words spilling out. "It was Susan. She's been arrested. She's been scamming you too. She took everything." His face went pale. He stood there for a long moment, a storm of emotions crossing his face. Then, the dam broke. He began to cry, silent tears streaming down his face as he crumbled into my arms. "She took everything. Ava," he sobbed. "She took the house, the business, my savings. She took everything." I held him, my own tears falling onto his shoulder. The anger I had felt for 3 years evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming sense of love and compassion. We stood there for a long time, two broken people clinging to each other, the truth finally exposed, and the long, painful silence finally, mercifully, over. We spent the next few hours in my father's house, the silence no longer a barrier, but a space filled with shared grief and unspoken apologies. My father, Robert, looked at me with a mixture of shame and relief. Shame for letting Susan deceive him, and relief that I was finally here. He told me everything, his voice a raw confession of a man who had lost his way. I was so lonely after you left," he confessed, his eyes fixed on the empty space where our family photos used to hang. "Susan came into my life at the perfect time. She made me feel needed. She told me she understood my values, my traditions. She said you had abandoned them, and me." My heart ached for him. She was a master manipulator, Dad. She knew exactly what to say to get what she wanted. "I know that now," he said, the words heavy with regret. "When she filed for divorce, I thought it was a terrible mistake. But then I saw the bank statements, the money. It was all gone. All the savings I had worked for my entire life, gone. She took it all." He confessed that he had been too proud to tell anyone, especially me. He had been living in denial, too ashamed to admit that he had been so easily fooled. The letter, he said, was a final attempt to reach out to me, but he hadn't known how. Susan had found his old journal, with drafts of the letters he had written to me over the years, and used his pain to craft the perfect lie. "She knew I wanted to talk to you," he whispered. "She used that against me. She used our silence as a weapon." Tears streamed down my face. I realized that my father wasn't just a victim of Susan's scam, he was a victim of his own pride and his own broken heart. We had both been alone, but in our own separate ways. "I'm so sorry, Dad," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I should have been here. I should have tried harder to understand." "No, Ava," he said, his eyes filled with a new kind of clarity. "I was the one who was stubborn. I was the one who refused to see that your happiness was more important than my traditions. I should have supported you, not pushed you away." We talked for hours, the dam that had been built between us for 3 years finally breaking. We talked about everything, the fight, the silence, and the pain we had both carried. We were no longer two separate people, but two halves of a whole, finally reunited. As the sun began to set, I realized something. The letter, the scam, and the pain of the past 3 years had all been a part of a terrible but necessary journey. It had taken a lie to expose the truth, and a tragedy to bring us back together. We had lost so much, but we had found each other again, and this time, we knew that our love for each other was stronger than any lie or any silence. The sun had long since set, and my father's living room, once so familiar, now felt like a sanctuary. We sat together, not as two people who had been separated by 3 years of silence, but as a family that had finally found its way back. The air was no longer heavy with tension, but filled with a new kind of quiet understanding. "What about Susan?" my father asked, his voice still a little hoarse. "Will she go to jail?" "She's been arrested for fraud," I said. "And she's facing serious charges. My grandfather's legal team is on it. She won't be able to hurt you, or anyone else again." A wave of relief washed over his face. "Thank you, Ava," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "I could never give up on you, Dad," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "Family doesn't do that. We just lost our way for a while." We spent the rest of the night talking, not about the past, but about the future. I told him about my work, my successes, and my struggles. He listened with an open heart and a newfound sense of pride. He told me about his life after I left, about the loneliness, and about the mistake he had made by letting Susan into his life. He admitted that he had been so focused on preserving his legacy that he had almost lost the one thing that truly mattered: me. "I always thought that being a father meant passing on a legacy," he said, his eyes filled with tears. "But I realize now that being a father means letting your children build their own. I'm so proud of the woman you've become, Ava. You're strong, independent, and you fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself." The words were a balm to my soul, healing a wound I had carried for 3 years. We decided to take things one step at a time. I would help him with his financial situation, and he would help me with my emotional one. We would rebuild our relationship, not on a foundation of tradition and expectations, but on one of love and trust. As I was about to leave, my father stopped me. "Ava," he said, "I know I can't undo the past, but I want to write you a letter. A real one. One that's filled with all the things I've wanted to say for 3 years." I smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached my eyes. "I'd like that, Dad," I said. "I'd like that very much." I left his house that night, not with a sense of sadness, but with a sense of hope. The silence was finally broken. The fake letter, which had been a symbol of betrayal, had become a catalyst for our reunion. It was a painful journey, but it was worth it. Because sometimes, it takes a lie to reveal the truth, and a tragedy to bring us back home. Days turned into weeks, and the silence that had once defined my life was now replaced by the comforting rhythm of regular phone calls and shared dinners. My father's voice, once distant and unfamiliar, now sounded stronger, filled with a new kind of hope. He began to rebuild his life, not with the goal of returning to his old self, but with the hope of becoming a better man. I helped him with his finances, a task that once felt like a chore now felt like a privilege. We worked together, side by side, and in doing so, we rebuilt our trust. He was no longer the stubborn, proud man I had left behind. He was a man who had been humbled by betrayal, but not broken. He was a man who was finally ready to admit his mistakes and move on. One day, I received a package in the mail. It was a thick, leather-bound journal, the kind I used to love as a child. I opened it and saw my father's familiar handwriting on the first page. It wasn't the fake, perfect script of the scam letter, but his real, imperfect handwriting, with its slight lean to the right. "My dearest Ava," the letter began. "I know words can't make up for 3 years of silence, but I hope this will be a start. I'm so sorry for everything. I was so afraid of losing my legacy that I almost lost you. But you, my daughter, are my legacy. Your strength, your independence, your kindness, that is the legacy I am most proud of." The tears streamed down my face as I read the letter, filled with all the things he had wanted to say for 3 years. It was a letter of apology, of love, and of a father's profound regret. It was a letter that was a symbol of a new beginning, a new chapter in our lives. The scam had been a terrible, painful event, But it had also been a necessary one. It had forced us to face the truth, to confront our pain, and to rebuild our family from the ground up. It had taught us that love is not about perfection, but about forgiveness. It had taught us that silence is a weapon, but a shared voice is a gift. As I held the letter, I knew that the 3 years of silence had not been for nothing. They had been a dark and difficult journey, but they had led us to this moment. A moment of reunion, of healing, and of a love that was stronger and more resilient than ever before. We were not just a family again. We were a family that had been tested and had passed, and that, I realized, was the greatest legacy of all.